welcome. We're very excited to see a good turnout today. And the reason why we're all here is to discuss a little bit on the use of some ICTs for open contracting in fragile and conflict-affected states. You may have seen a report around, and this was a work between Integrity Action and the World Bank Institute, a joint work. And so the purpose of this report is pretty much to introduce some of the ICT efforts that have been happening around the world, mostly on fragile and conflict-affected states, and how these can actually help inform some of the open contracting work. So today we're very excited to have with us Claire Schouten from Integrity Action, and she will be presenting, and afterwards we will continue with a panel discussion which will be moderated by my colleague Felipe Estefan. So first of all, Claire Schouten has 10 years of experience in international development and conflict-affected states. She focuses on integrity, transparency, and accountability in public resource management, from aid and extractives to infrastructure and service delivery. She works with civil society governments and donors on organizational development, action learning, monitoring, and policy guidance. She also has field experience in Africa, the Caribbean, Central and Southeast Asia, and also in the Middle East. Claire is a leading voice in the development of the open contracting, and of which her organization, Integrity Action, is a member of the steering group member. Prior to joining Integrity Action, Claire worked at the Humanitarian Affairs Officer with the United Nations mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Claire also leads the Network for Integrity and Reconstruction, a network of post-war civil society organizations that are monitoring aid and reconstruction. She also is an advisor to several of transparency and accountability initiatives around the world, including the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative and obviously open contracting. So please help me give a welcome to Claire Schouten, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So as Norma was highlighting, we're really here to talk about the use of ICTs, so information and communication technologies, for open contracting in fragile and conflict-affected states. And so I'll be highlighting some of the concepts, some of the tools that we've been studying, not particularly in the open contracting process, but could inform the open contracting process. So again, it's a lively discussion, so I hope you'll contribute, and I look forward to hearing more about your experiences and tools. I'm just curious, how many people work in fragile states here? Okay, good number. So as many of us know, the term fragile states is quite a vague concept in some ways. So it ranges from 35 countries in the Harmonized World Bank list to 47 countries in the OECD list. And the definitions vary, but it's generally they're noted for their limited ability to govern their territory and failure to build those constructive and reinforcing relations with society. And generally, about 70% of fragile states have experienced violence and conflict since 1989. And about home to 14% of the population, or 33% of the world's poorest, which is likely to increase to 50% by 2015. And they're incredibly resource-rich and aid-dependent countries as well, with 38% of total overseas the aid flowing into these countries, about US dollars 50 billion. And when we were looking at ICT tools, we were looking at the ways citizens use these tools, and that's changed dramatically in the last decade or so. And we're looking at the concepts of ICT for development as well. So the use of information technology, these tools, devices, the applications applied for socioeconomic development and human rights fulfillment. And here, open contracting, how many people are familiar with that term? Wow, great. Good to know. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a global movement for increased transparency and public participation in public contracting. So many of us in the room have been involved in really shaping this movement and sharing tools and knowledge and building capacities of different stakeholders in this process. so for me, in terms of open contracting, it's also about the social contract. So that bond between state and society. So what I've highlighted here is for the accountability chain. And often we see the donors and the taxpayers, so their accountability to their own citizens. And we often see the contract between the donors and the implementing agencies. And often there isn't quite a contract between donors and the state in reconstruction, but that's more available as well. But often what's lacking is that contract or accountability to beneficiaries or citizens in these countries. And we advocate for, rather than just a focus on audit and financial accountability upwards, how can we engage citizens on the access to information, monitoring and evaluation, and ensuring feedback and response mechanisms? And ultimately, the affected communities, we argue, have to be reintegrated into the accountability chain. So when we were studying the use of ICT for open contracting in fragile and conflict affected states, as often is the case, context is key. And so understanding these contexts, we were looking at population and literacy rates. We were looking at democratization or the democratic space to engage citizens, and this was the Economist Intelligence Unit Index. So largely the states that we were looking at are authoritarian to hybrid, and with Timor-Leste being a flawed democracy. We were looking at the issues of access to information. So here we're highlighting some of the countries known as fragile and conflict affected states that have access to information. So you have countries like Liberia, which we were considering in the study. We're looking a lot at Nigeria, for example, and looking at Kyrgyzstan and Mongolia and Nepal and Palestine, which have had interesting developments on access to information. Welcome. We are also looking at the independence of the media. And largely in fragile and conflict affected states, these countries are not particularly free or partly free in this sense. And we were also looking at the ICT infrastructure. So as many of us know, mobiles, there's about 65% penetration, for example, in the continent of Africa, with 69% of mobiles in Africa having internet access by 2014. So we were looking at the dynamics of context in each particular setting and how these might shape the use or engagement of ICT in public engagement. So I'm going to present some examples from the study that we were doing, and again, we were looking at examples of the use of ICT throughout the contracting or budget cycle, so from financing through to the allocation of public resources through participatory budgeting, for example, through to off-budget or budget execution, and the monitoring of procurement and the monitoring of public services, all the way to audits and evaluation. So this was an example in terms of financing with our colleagues here at Publish What You Fund and Open Spending with the Open Knowledge Foundation, working with the Ministry of Finance in Uganda. And this was an effort that took about 6 months to really clean the data and mapping aid data with Uganda's budget data. And again, it took a very dedicated team to clean this information and map this data here. So it's quite useful in terms of identifying how aid fits with the budget process and domestic spending. So when this came out, as you can see, the information is from 2003 to 2006. So while this is a very helpful tool, it was quite challenging in terms of journalists, making a story out of it because they were looking for perhaps more updated information. So and as we know in fragile states, many audit reports, for example, don't come out until 3 years later. So it's a challenge to see how we can continue to map aid and budget resources so fragile and conflict-affected states can actually plan and budget accordingly. And I was just in South Sudan, and there's quite a lot of interest there where the donors actually are reporting quite consistently, so perhaps there's an opportunity there. Another example is procurement monitoring. So this is PPDC, this is in Nigeria, and they're a group where they took the enabling legislation, where there are clauses there that allow for citizen monitoring, and they developed this tool as a portal to enable citizen monitors to collect data, to report the data, to share the data. And they follow up with the respective departments on the issues that are identified. And in the study, when we were interviewing them, they were highlighting the challenges of human resources, because if citizens don't go on the ground to monitor, this isn't going to be an effective tool. And they also highlighted the challenges of maintaining this ICT infrastructure. So it was quite interesting to see a very innovative tool, how the challenges of sustaining it. This is another example from Punjab in Pakistan. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is a governance model where they use SMS and callback systems. So service users provide their mobile numbers, and after the service, the Punjab authorities call the citizens and ask about the service provision. And in the cases, often, if there are particular complaints, these are aggregated and they follow up. So often, service providers have been dismissed or adequately sanctioned as such. So what we do as part of the Network for Integrity and Reconstruction, we're active in these countries and we're engaging citizens and civil society in engaging authorities and monitoring the use of public resources. So as Norma was saying, from aid and extractives through to infrastructure and service delivery. So you can see very different country contexts, and I tried to highlight some of the transparency initiatives in which these countries are involved. So Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Liberia, Timor-Leste, these are all participants in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I've also highlighted the Open Budget Index, for example, which just came out recently. And countries like the DRC and Afghanistan have made quite strong advances on the OBI. And also freedom of information. So in Afghanistan and Timor-Leste, they're in the process, Palestine as well, they're in the process of developing freedom of information legislation. And finally, OC, open contracting, where there are some examples already. And I think Palestine is also an interesting example in the sense that they're institutionalizing monitoring by engaging students and integrating social audits in the school system. So we're always quite keen to hear about examples, not just of one-off monitoring, but how you can integrate this into a system. So that's kind of an interesting example as well. And here you see the different civil society organizations and the various priorities that are identified by communities that they choose to monitor. And it's using scorecards, it's using beneficiary surveys, and they triangulate that with photographic evidence and with access to information, so comparing reality with the project documents. So a tool that we wanted to highlight in particular is called DevelopmentCheck. We actually worked with some of the colleagues in the room to develop this, and we worked in partnership with a group called Young Innovations, and these are developers based in Nepal. And it's a fantastic collaboration because they're also involved in the International Aid Transparency Initiative Technical Advisory Group, and it clicked right away. They understood the need for us to monitor, and we realized, talking with our different colleagues, that there is no citizens' feedback mechanism for the Aid Transparency Initiative, as is the case, unfortunately, for many of these transparency initiatives. So in the process of developing capacities of these organizations, we wanted to ensure that their monitoring evidence was provided as a feedback mechanism. So what you have here, this is the homepage. You have the different countries where you're active, and we, of course, welcome more countries to adopt the tool. And we look particularly at these indicators on access to information, so whether communities can access project documents, on community engagement, whether they're involved in the project design or in the implementation, and the effectiveness and satisfaction. So when the communities find any problems in the monitoring process, they identify those problems, and then we can track whether those problems were resolved, and ultimately whether communities were satisfied. So maybe we can just go. So here's an example. This is in Timor-Leste. So we see the basic information on the country, so the project status. Normally it's an implementation process, actually, so it's not a complete project. The sector, and again, the sector codes are all in line with the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And the number of beneficiaries, I mean, that's a bit small, 38 households, a very small country. The implementing agency, the donors, the government department, the contractor, the budget, the start and end date. And ultimately, if the start date, the time frame, if there are cost or budget overruns, there's a flag that comes up as well to highlight this. And these types of information, I mean, the budget information is often very difficult for our partners to access. And this is a project description, and again, the integrity indicator. So it's meant to be a very visual, simple snapshot of whether citizens have access to information, whether they're engaged in the process, and whether these projects are effective. So you can see here, again, you can see whether they had access to project documents, and again, you can see for each feature how it's calculated, and whether they were engaged, whether they were involved in the project implementation, and then ultimately the effectiveness, so whether problems were resolved. And here you can see on the right, sorry, thank you. You can see the photos that they include. So we asked them to present photos at the respective monitoring dates. So this will track the monitoring dates and show any progress between those dates. And the documents. So in this case, they're able to access the bill of quantity. And this is often quite rare. So our partners in Afghanistan often say, we just can't get the contract or the bill of quantity. So this is quite an interesting case. So again, it's very interesting to understand the country dynamics. In a place like Timor-Leste, at the time of independence, they were all deciding whether to be government or whether to be civil society. It's a very intimate relationship that they have. Whereas a country like Afghanistan, where it's not necessarily a strong connection between the state and society, very different challenges. But that said, President Karzai in Decree 45, he's now said that all government contracts have to be published and monitored. And he's asked our partner organization to do all the monitoring. Unfortunately, they don't have the capacity to do that. So we're in the process of trying to build wider civil society engagement in this process. So that's really just a quick snapshot of the efforts that we've been engaged in terms of open contracting and really trying to build a systematic evidence base, because that's been one of the hardest challenges for us in terms of gathering credible evidence. And so that's a process that we work quite a lot with our partners. And ultimately, I mean, we provided recommendations in the report, but these are some of the questions that we're really trying to understand and address as we use ICT tools, because it's only a way of complementing constructive engagement, not substituting for it. So do we understand the context? Do we have a good diagnostic of the problem? Does the tool reinforce a particular strategy? What are some of the comparative advantages of the tool? So often, for example, we still emphasize community radio rather than the use of smartphones or SMS, for example. Who are the providers and users? And often that's quite surprising. So we were looking at a case in Sierra Leone, for example, of an online repository of all the extracted contracts, thinking that, of course, Parliament's going to be interested, civil society will really pick this up. And actually it was investors who were looking into that information. Similarly, in a tool in Liberia that was used to monitor the deliverables of the poverty reduction strategy, again, thinking civil society would be very interested, local actors, it was actually the diaspora that was really tracking that and feeding into public debates. So again, it's quite interesting to consider who the providers and users are. And ultimately, as I was saying, whether that information is credible and timely and accessible. And furthermore, the report also highlights some of the enabling processes that we can build in terms of partnerships across technologists and local civil society or different actors so that we can drive reform processes and ensure that we close that loop, ensuring that feedback actually leads to corrective action or enabling action, and ultimately whether it's sustainable. So for example, in the Eastern DRC, we were looking at a participatory budget process, and it really did build trust, it really enabled citizens to pay taxes because they saw the merits of the work that they were doing. That said, once the SMSs aren't funded anymore, it's very difficult to mobilize citizens that way. So how can we explore partnerships with the telecoms company, for example, or other ways to sustain these very important initiatives? So with that, I'll leave it. Feel free to get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I look forward to the lively discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I don't think I was on the schedule. I was supposed to be the one kind of welcoming you and introducing you to Norma did, and I was not able to do that because I was called by my bosses to attend some very boring meeting. I could have left. But isn't Claire great?
Yeah.
You know, I know that we're doing well in open contracting, and there are people like Claire talking about open contracting. So thank you very much, Claire.
Thank you.
Just a quick word. So my name is Robert Hunja. I work at the World Bank Institute. I manage the open government practice, where at least in the WBI, where the open contracting work is housed. And my history is in contracting. I'm a procurement professional. So for me, this is really personal stuff. And I personally care that this agenda takes hold. When you think about it, actually, there is almost an accepted global norm that budgets should be public. It's not the case for contracts. And when you think about it, that's really crazy because a lot of budgets are managed through contracts. So part of the new norm that we're looking to kind of develop in the world is that contracts should not be held in secret. They should all be disclosed, whether it's contracts in extractive, we've talked about Ict Infrastructure. And more importantly, that they should be disclosed in a manner that citizens will be able to understand the data and to be able to use it for monitoring purposes. and to bring technology to that purpose. So I think that's what we're talking about here today. And really what's interesting, especially for fragile states, when you think about it, is that the reason we call, or the reason they're called fragile is because that very basic kind of nexus between the citizen and the government has broken down. And one way to really recreate that social compact is by having greater transparency, where government is disclosing and sharing more and more with the citizens, and citizens are engaging with the data and information that has been disclosed. So it's not only just about the technical side of the work. I think it's really, especially in fragile environments, really important to recreating that trust and the social compact between citizens and government. So I want to welcome you to be soldiers and to join us in this journey. It's going to be very exciting, and I'm very excited to have all of you today. So Felipe, you take it from here.
Thanks, Robert.
Do all of you know Felipe? If you don't,
I'm Felipe Estefan, and Robert is my boss. I do what he tells me.
that's what you should always say.
I'm being told that there's a light here. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Felipe Estefan. I'm part of the Open Government team at the World Bank Institute, and we're very happy that you're here as part of this sort of living room conversation, and we try to organize this event in a way where it would be sort of like if we were hosting you at our house with some drinks and some food. There's still some more wine I see over there that needs to be drank, and there's some more food, and so this is very informal. What we're gonna do right now is just a very brief panel discussion, and then I'm gonna open it up for questions. So we can talk about the role of ICTs in open contracting, but also in development more in general. And I know there's a seat here, there's some seats that are gonna be opening up here. So do whatever you wanna do. This is that kind of living room that where you can sit in the floor if you'd like, and we're very thankful to the OpenGov Hub for allowing us to do that. So I'm gonna invite Katrin Verclas from NDI and Chris Albon from FrontlineSMS to join Claire and I, and we'll start a little bit of a conversation. And also just a couple of housekeeping items. The report that Claire was referring to is this one right here. There's copies around. My colleague Norma Garza here can also point you to some if you would like to take some, and we're also more than happy to share the copies of the report with you. Also, we're trying to keep this conversation going on Twitter as well. So if you would like to tweet about it, the hashtag is open contracting. Our handle for open contracting is also the term open contracting. And we hope that after engaging with us more and more, those of you that don't yet know what open contracting is will certainly know. And if you want more information about open contracting, please feel free to talk to myself or to Robert or Norma or any of my colleagues that are around the room, or Claire as well. So what I wanted us to start with was actually the very first line of the report, because I found that line very interesting. And so the report starts with the line, the way citizens and organizations have been using ICTs in the past decade has created dramatic new possibilities for public transparency, accountability, and participation. And so, Chris, I wanted to start with you. What are some of those new opportunities that we didn't have 10 years ago in 2003 that we do now in 2013?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely when it comes to technology, the thing that allows it to enable open contracting so much more than it did previously is dissemination. Right? Because of technology, you can get the information out far more than you otherwise could, and that is exceptionally important. That is, if you were to distribute this over paper, you're going to get 10 people to read it. If you can distribute it over different medias, you're going to get far, far, far more participation in it. And I mean, the other thing that actually comes out is when you send that information out, because of technology, you can get that feedback back in, right? You can actually make a two-way conversation instead of a one-way conversation. Now, I mean, you know, I think what I absolutely have to qualify that is that, you know, technology absolutely provides the possibility of amazing things when it comes to open contracting. But technology is 5%, right? We can build, at FrontlineSMS, we can build amazing tools to do the stuff that you want to do. We can build things that, you know, allow people to send in feedback, provide tickets, we can export it wherever you want, all those things. But the other 95%, right? The other 95% is those classic areas of development. It's about politics, it's about culture. In academia, we call it thick description, right? Context, understanding those cultures, understanding those bureaucracies, and then finding ways where you can incentivize the people in the government and the other stakeholders to actually take that information and, based on their own incentives, use that to benefit what you want.
Katrin, what do you think? Do we have new opportunities?
Absolutely. I think the playing field has changed. It's changed forever. Game over, right? I think so. I don't think there's any doubt that I'm coming from the mobile world, and mobile has really revolutionized the way we interact, communicate, organize, etc., etc. But that's not new to anyone in the room, and we keep talking about it as if it were. And so I feel like, all right, can we move on and now talk about, all right, how do we use the fact that technology is ubiquitous, accessible to pretty much anybody, at extremely low cost, and the cost is getting lower every day. What does that mean, right? So what does that mean in terms of access to information, not just data, but actually information? What does that mean for political change? Because I think a lot of times, and I think you invited me maybe to be a little bit of the controversial voice, and I know nothing about open contracting. That's not what NDI does. National Democratic Institute does democracy support with legislatures, civil society organizations, parties, etc. Heavy use of technology, but we don't do, as far as I know, none of our projects do open contracting. However, so how do we turn that then into the ability to access technology, the ability to use technology, the ability to organize technology into political change? And I think we don't talk often enough about this next step, and I had a great conversation actually earlier with, where is he, Johannes, somewhere in the room, where we're talking about a sort of interesting lack of understanding that a lot of the CSOs that we certainly work with on the political context.
Welcome to my living room.
Wow.
It's open.
I think you should pass them.
Yeah. Can we get it around?
The political economy, political organizing skills, how do we actually move stakeholders to change the way they do business, right? Can we talk about power? So let's stop talking about technology. Let's start talking about organizing, which ultimately means ruffling feathers and power shifts, right? And we don't talk about that. That's not a matter of technology. That's a matter of, as our dear friend, the ICT jester says, that's in amplifying human intent, right? And so there's a lot of cart before horse talk with the emphasis on technology, and I think at some point or another, I'm hoping that this field will be mature enough that we stop talking about tech, start talking about power.
Yeah, I think, you made an absolutely great point with information versus data, right? We've all, this is a room of wonks, I imagine, and this is a dangerous place to be in, because I'm the one thing between you guys and an open bar, so this is, from my perspective, this is dangerous. But when we talk about there's
we
so...
meant that with the...
We've solved it. Feel free to pop the wine over here.
Also between us and the open bars.
But there's a huge issue. There's a large number of open contracting or open government projects, but what they really mean is open data. And data isn't information, right? I was talking to the guy who's in charge, the guy who's absolutely in charge of a whole government's procurement system. And I won't say who it is and I won't say the country. But he said, I went out on a limb and I made sure that all contracts you can get online. I made sure, this was a huge fight. I went for it. I got it. You can go download it. No civil society downloads it. No one cares that you can get all these contracts. And, of course, the obvious reason is processing, making some kind of understanding from tens of thousands of government contracts is actually really hard. That's the difference between raw data and information. And that I think you hit it right.
And let's go further, right? From information to organizing to actually changing practices. Because ultimately, what's the ultimate goal here, right? Open contracting is not an end goal. Open contracting is the end goals are decrease of corruption, influence peddling, a fairer playing game, a more fair playing game for, name it, right? What's the...
Poverty eradication,
Well, and that's sort of the ultimate, much bigger goal, which I'm not sure that we'll ever. I'm not sure exactly how that follows from open contracting. Or maybe
that's why I brought you. I'm glad you.
but I love, so I scanned this and I have to admit I haven't thoroughly read it.
No problem.
But if you look at some of these instances, and some of them are very public, right? Like the Twaweza, case study, it wasn't open contracting, it was water monitoring. And we have projects, look, NDI's got projects that failed, for sure. But we used ICT and then, hello, nobody came, or, we didn't do a good enough job of analyzing the interest, self-interest, or power interest of certain constituencies, and we ran into all sorts of roadblocks. And so, I think there's, if you're all really honest, right, tell me the open contracting projects right now at this moment in time, or even more generally, accountability, transparency projects that really are ultimate successes. I mean, I'd love to hear about them, and I hope we get to talk about some of them. But if we're really honest, most of them, we're still, in the Wild West and experimenting a lot, and granted, part of that has failed. But I think there's something that we're missing here, and I'm concerned that we're moving, that the conversation is too much focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I
Sorry.
think that's
Claire,
that's a good segue. And Claire, I wanted to bring you in on this because sometimes when we talk about open contracting, a lot of the times we're actually trying to talk about some of the points that you're bringing up, Katrin and Chris, that actually relate to changing the way that things have been done for a long time, right? And there's the paradigm shift that comes with that is, of course, one that relates very closely to power, in which technology is not the single factor. And so, I think perhaps Claire, if you could make the linkage for people that are wondering where that linkage is between the role of ICTs sort of in that larger objective of changing the way that things are done with public contracting around the world.
I think, well, as you were saying, it's about enabling processes, and it's about complementing constructive engagement for me. So I think in some of the examples that we were highlighting, it's really about shifting from data to information and packaging it in a way that makes sense to citizens, that they can use this information, that it's not about a technical exercise, but it's about a useful exercise for them to track what matters to them, like services, like public goods, infrastructure. These are critical projects that keep failing because somewhere along the accountability chain, money's gone missing or there hasn't been oversight. So we see it over and over again, and there's such a lack of attention in general to procurement in fragile states. So there's a lot of attention on public financial management and reform, and that's great. But again, getting more oversight, more citizen mechanisms, engagement, I think that's the critical part. And many of the times, Afghanistan, for example, they're saying, yeah, we like smartphones, but we're not really getting into it because the Taliban just grab our telephones, look at and harass us, and there's a real risk using technology sometimes in these contexts. So I think we have to be aware of that as well. And ethical, it's another example, the obsession with Facebook in a way and how useful it is. And this person said, I created a profile as a beautiful woman, and I contacted public authorities, and they ended up sharing contracts with me because they thought I was a beautiful woman creating this fake profile. Like, I don't really want to hear that. I don't want to know that's the way you're getting contracts. But it's really interesting. So again, it's what are the innovative ways that we can engage? And I think and with the Arab Spring, for example, again, so much attention to social media. There's this really interesting research on how actually the mobilization happened in taxi cabs. People are spreading the message that way. So I think we have to look a bit outside the box, and yes, technology can be fantastic and it can really enable constructive processes, but it can also create risks or hinder the process as well.
No, I think that the thing I really, really actually loved about the report was that when, I come from academia, right? Like we have a very standard way when we deal with these, right? You do literature review, you survey the field, you develop a theory, you run a test to see if that theory is true or not, and then you go back and you revise your theory if it's not true, or if it's true, you move on. That's how it was going, right? And so when you see this open contract, I was at the first open contracting. This is a brand new thing, right? There have been open contracting initiatives before, but this full push from the World Bank is brand new. And what was so great about the report is it provides a survey of this open contracting landscape. There's some amazing facts in there. So there's this incredible Asia focus, right? 13 of 25 fragile states, right, are in Asia, right? But when we think of development, this is this absolutely bias that happens so much in the developing world. We go, oh, Africa. You know what? The states that they name, right? Let's say okay, so 3 of the 4 states, India, China, and Indonesia, right? Those are 3 of the 4 most populous states in the whole world. And they are the fragile states, and they are the ones that, like, come up in these reports. This is why it's important. This is a huge demographic of the population. This is a huge issue. And I mean, there's so much variety within these states, right? I mean, the difference between Pakistan and China when it comes from infrastructure, right? Because when we're talking about open contracting, we're talking about infrastructure. Because when we talk about fragile states, we're talking about institutions with weak legitimacy, right? But if you're going to have good open contracting, that is the huge issue, because you have to have government involvement by definition, right? By definition, with contracting, you have government involvement. If those are weak institutions, there is a huge problem with getting citizens involved and making those institutions able to take that feedback. And that's like, I thought I did a great job of just surveying that whole area.
Who's free balance? Ha!
Oh, that's me. A Twitter personality.
Yeah, that's it.
So you just tweeted that there was you have an interesting model and some case studies. So you wanna talk about that?
Well,
You want to take my chair? You can come up. Stand back there. You can.
No,
I'm just
sorry.
looking.
I'm Canadian. We have to sit down and follow all the rules. First of all, we do have the back office financial management systems in many of those countries, including the front office e-procurement system and the transparency portal and the results portal, which wasn't mentioned, by the way, Timo. And as a technology provider who's a bit different in the sense that we provide technology, but we also involve in public financial management reform, we definitely have a different viewpoint. And it is quite typical to get the conversation that goes, oh yeah, you get public financial management reform, as you mentioned. People get all excited about that. Or technology doesn't do anything, but yet we see that has an immediate impact. Public financial management has a tendency to change behaviors because all of a sudden everything's auditable. You must follow the procedures, otherwise you can't. Everything's audited. Transparency, people know they're more likely to be caught. Now, in and of itself, that has an effect. But all of the other aspects we talk about, things like civil society capacity and interest,
Yeah, I saw that in there.
which is part of our framework, and independence of audit organizations, the capability of audit to do things like enforcement without political interference, and then the various aspects that you automate. So procurement is one aspect of it. Human resource recruitment would be another aspect, or removing ghost employees and so on and so forth, has immediate effects in things like anti-corruption, has effects in efficiency and effectiveness. And I think that sometimes, because we recognize some of the gaps, right? Oh, civil society may not be, in fact, interested in open procurement in country X, or audit is not independent in country Y. Well, it wasn't independent in developed countries for the longest time either. It's something that takes. It's so you get a progressive improvement. But often we don't look at underlying in the technology, how can that technology actually, in and of itself, provide controls that all of a sudden support an increasing improvement in capacity across the organization. So one of the sort of unspoken things, people talk about, let's say, open contracting, and don't realize why it's so important that should integrate directly with the back office system, not go through some process, so that the back office, so nobody can manipulate that data from the point where it gets so it follows the rules and the processes, so that in fact when you decide that you'd like to contract that vendor, you have to make sure it ties up with your previous commitment, otherwise you're going above the budget. Or on the other hand, if it's well below your commitment, that you can decommit those funds. And to have that process fully audited throughout the track, so that if you come in to say, okay, what went wrong, you're able to track it all the way back to the original budget and what you intended to do. And so I think that as a technology provider, I thought that I would tweet some things about how technology provides
And
that.
I mean, it's a really good framework, but the thing that struck me, so I completely agree with you, because there's this interesting function shifting, and we see it in elections, right? So we do a ton of election monitoring at the polling station. Well, you know what? Guess what? Fraud time shifts. It goes now into the pre-election. We were so great at accountability and transparency at the polls that the fraud just time shifted, right? And so my suspicion is that if you are not covering the whole spectrum, right? That even in open contracting, it sort of function shifts or time shifts, to some other place because the political situation,
Well,
the
I think,
economy really
I think the
changed,
other
right?
thing, depending, the context is important, but it's to recognize that perfection is the enemy of good. And so these
Really?
things,
You are
these
my
things,
you're my best friend.
these
right
things,
now.
these things, so that they have a tendency to build
I'm
up.
German, I need
So there's a
perfection.
tendency for people, so my viewpoint, we have a tendency to want so-called best practices to operate in developing countries, right? And yet, in our own countries, we're not following those practices. My country is going to release our budget on Thursday, 10 days before the fiscal year ends. That was, what would the open budget give that? Pretty much nothing, right? And everything's about budget confidentiality and all these sorts of things. And it's only been recently that there's been real parliamentary scrutiny. So we have to look at that and say, wait a second, what is the true situation in Liberia or Sierra Leone or Timor-Leste, and let's compare that with what it was like, let's say, in the United States in the 1920s as a comparison, or in the 1860s in terms of where we need to be. And surely we can leapfrog, we can help them leapfrog so they don't make the same mistakes we do, but we have to look at it to see continuing improvement.
So I have a long list of questions, but I see people's faces and hands coming up, and so I'm just gonna discard my questions and open it up because it sounds like the discussion is starting. There's a lot of interesting things. I think one point that would be interesting to explore more as well is what you were bringing up, Katrin, in regards to power disruption, because sometimes people talk a lot about participatory processes and technology and how they can disrupt power structures, but they don't often talk about what happens later, which is the creation of a new power structure and what that looks like, or whether or not that's the case.
Actually, he's putting it really well in this framework. It's capacity of stakeholders, political will, standards, and compliance.
Independence. It's just, that's just,
I
well,
don't
that's
know
only
much
part
about
of the
that.
framework. It's only,
But I mean, these are all really good things. And notice technology is mentioned in that, right? Like thousands of technology.
Free balance on Twitter, at Free Balance.
And
So
do this.
I
It's a
know
good
you wanted to
process.
comment
Okay.
on this, so let me go to you, and then if people have other comments or questions, I'll start going around and just tell us who you are, what your name is, and where you're coming to this conversation from. And
Okay, so my name is Paul Biska. I'm a consultant in the Social Development Department. I guess I'm coming of the World Bank.
Okay.
Yeah, that's sort of like given around here. Like they don't mention where they're from. It's probably the world.
I'm sorry, it's just a bad habit.
No. It's I'm.
It's just,
I agree.
no, it's just a bad habit.
Welcome.
if you don't go to the World Bank comes to you.
I've
Yes.
never really felt so important. Anyway, just a couple of quick points. I believe I heard China and India mentioned as fragile states. Maybe I'm
I
brain
wanted
dead or
to
something.
correct that. Yeah.
But these are not fragile states, and if anybody in the in the board will hear you, or anybody else in this institution saying that they are, they will be a bit sort of freaking out. So that's one point. Second point is, I've looked at this only in the past couple of months to review that we're doing on ICT and violence prevention. So I'm fairly new to this. My questions may be a function of strictly that small time frame. But judging on what you said about the role of PFM and in reducing corruption, a study by the public finance and public sector governance group within the World Bank, by about 16 states, said recently, came out a month ago, that actually PFM reforms don't do much to reduce corruption. They help, but they're not really essential. So to me,
now it doesn't matter if PFM reform is putting a government resource planning system in, regardless of the reform, immediately reduces corruption. You want to look at Afghanistan, for example. You want to know how much money goes through their financial system that gets exported as dollars? Not very much. Almost all that money comes off budget. That's because it's fully tracked. Now there could be corruption in process the way through, but every dime that goes into that system is managed, is audited, and is connected. And they're able to produce financial statements IPSIS compliant on time.
sure.
So
I just because there's a lot of other questions.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that we get more
Sure.
voices in the room. But in the meantime, Claire, do you want to respond to the point about the definition of fragile
Yeah,
states,
no, it was a
which
tricky
know
one. I
differs?
agree.
Let
I
him
mean,
finish his point.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I just had a final comment, and
Oh,
we
sorry.
can talk about it later. I just have a final comment, which is perhaps it would be interesting to judge how, in fragile states where you have sometimes so few qualified firms, to provide that type of services that you need in development projects. Well, the rules of international organizations are somewhat strict, that you need, sometimes 5 suppliers to do that, and you have 2 actually who are qualified. How can technology help maybe make those things more flexible, or any other comments that you might have from this perspective on that? That's all, thanks.
So do you wanna?
I was just in terms of the definitions. We were really drawing on a wider set of countries where we could, countries like India and Indonesia, where we could learn more from some of the tools that have been implemented there. So I agree. In terms of the definition, we were going with countries that have limited ability to control their territory and don't build constructive relations.
But you can't put India and China in the same box with South Sudan. You just can't do that.
Yeah, no, I realized. It was more drawing on a wider range of countries. But yeah, it was a big debate that we were having within the team, but point well taken. And then your question was, well, perhaps you can comment more on the service providers, you mean, in terms of qualifying for, I think I'll leave that over to you, but in terms of the developers that we're working with, fantastic. And I think it really is about digging a bit deeper in these contexts, and these are incredible enablers as well, who understand what we're looking for, and I think, and we see it all over with tactical tech and various organizations. FrontlineSMS is in all sorts of fragile states, and it's I think it's really about mapping those providers and understanding a bit more about who's available. And but feel free to.
Sorry, what was the question? This way.
Which one?
The last one about
one.
sort of.
Yeah, I mean, the last one was just a remark. And I apologize for taking the time.
No. I'm the
was,
least interesting person in this room. So.
No, it was just saying that in many federal states you have very few companies or vendors who are qualified to do that type of job. And if you, let's say, if you're the World Bank and you say for a basic contract you need 5 suppliers or something, or 6 or 10, or how many of them, and there are only 2 in the country, your entire project gets stuck in that. And most task managers will end up using most of the time doing these processing types of things rather than thinking about the strategic part of the project. And so I was just wondering if ICT can help in any way, sort of, I guess, raise more awareness of that sort of reality, or just any thoughts you might have on that.
No, I mean, it definitely can't. It goes back, and this is like, I'm just going to harp on this again, but I mean, there's absolutely so many things that you can do with ICT, but it's about designing it well, right? Like Frontline is not a plug-and-play system if you want to sort of draw in people and run what you're talking about, right? It's about designing the program that fits into sort of what you want to accomplish, and then finding the tool that does that. Is that sort of getting it? Just a little bit, but to get back to your other point about what the definition of fragile states, and that's the least interesting discussion here. But I think what it absolutely does make the strong point about is that when we are talking about open contracting, when we are talking about how we can make open contracting an effective tool for governance, right, and make these government processes work better, and actually both do 2 things. One, right, improve the lives of citizens, which is obviously what we're all interested in here. But 2, doing it in other ways, such as like, more, so let's say open contracting equals more legitimacy for the government equals more FDI, right? Like these are actually things that can, work in many ways. But the solution is not going to be one, right? The solution that works in China is not going to be the solution that works in South Sudan, right? They might have some similarities. There might be a Venn diagram that overlaps. But I'm absolutely about looking and exploring these different sort of pathways in these different environments and seeing where open contracting works within sort of different contexts.
So I'm going to take 3 questions. I'm going to start with you, sir, in the back. You've been very patient. Thank you.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. The gentleman there didn't get your name. But earlier you mentioned that something about the access in the country. Say, for example, the young people were not accessing it. It's out there. So what I want to suggest to you, there is a big group outside Africa from those countries. They all have forums and discussion forums. If you make sure this is known frequently, just post it there. Those who are trying to knock the government in the head will take it and run with it. They will even do it more so than the civil society inside the country. So access
And
that.
who are they?
The diaspora have a lot of forums. You need to make sure you are on their mailing list and you send it to them. and then they will act on it.
So I was actually struck by what you said about CSOs were not particularly interested in open contract, but investors and the market, the for-profit market was, right? And I would think, just logically, as markets open up in various countries, as situations stabilize, particularly in fragile states, conflict recedes, etc., and institutions become more stable, that in fact it's actually not civil society, it's not citizens that have an interest in open contracting, but it is those that are wanting contracts, right? Right? So it's it used to be a closed market, it's cronyism and a certain set of people who are self-dealing all the time, right? So who has the most self-interest in an open market? For-profit companies that would do contracting, right? And so it's an interesting, I don't know if anybody, maybe you can speak to that, but what is the actual group of stakeholders here? And maybe we're targeting the wrong stakeholders, because I don't care what my town contracts out with. Really, truly, honestly, I don't care. Sort of maybe in a theoretical sense, but however, if I had a company and I would bid on something, hell yeah, I'm very interested in having a fair and open process, right? So are we targeting, by targeting citizens with all of these ICTs who may not have an enlightened self-interest here, or in the same way that, or CSOs, the same way that the for-profit market has, should we be engaging the market and companies much more directly?
2 other questions or comments? No questions?
Well,
Yes. Sure.
I have many things, but just to take the last point.
Yeah, do you want to introduce?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Rima Al-Azhar, and I am with the World Bank. I'm from the unit that's called Integrity, and we look at corruption in World Bank projects.
Mm-hmm.
So just take the last point that Katrin, no?
Katrin.
Katrin made about engaging with the private sector. It depends on the country again, because sometimes if you have very few companies, there might be collusion among this private sector, and even if you have open contracting, it's not going to help because they've already divided the pie. But for me, I want to go back to the initial thing, and I think again Katrin was pointing this out about ICT in general. Somebody yesterday said, ICT is just basically increasing the firepower on both sides. We're all talking about ICT here most of the time as a positive thing, but you mentioned that it also has its own risks. And ICT can actually be a very powerful tool in the hands of the government to repress people. And so it's not, so my question is, do you think ICT will work so greatly in a place where you don't really have democracy? I know a country that did a presentation here at the World Bank a few months ago about wanting to have every single person, even the Bedouins, and have access to internet and SMS and mobile phone and etc. But you know what that means? So this is a very repressive country. It means that it actually can go and kill the people one by one because they know exactly where they are, and they have the GPS location. They have all the information they want about this person. So are we really looking at ICT from both sides of the equation? It's just a tool. It's neither positive nor negative. It depends on who's handling the ICT. So that's what I would like to hear from the audience.
Anyone has a comment to that? Or a question that they would like to bring up? Claire, do you want?
Maybe I can.
Sorry? So we'll go here and then we'll come back to the panel.
So my name is Mark and I work with Publisher eFund, mostly on the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And it's kind of speaking to some of this discussion about raw data versus information. And it seems that this is this is a dichotomy which doesn't really exist, because what we really need both. So we need to, I think it's important to start with good quality, useful, interesting data, which is detailed and reliable and timely and accurate. But we also need to then have tools which access and visualize that information and make it understandable and comprehensible to different user groups. And we're just starting to kind of wrestle with what is our responsibility as advocates for better information from aid providers to get to then translate that data into particular tools for use by different user groups. So CSOs and parliamentarians, governments, recipient governments, and other donors and other aid providers. And basically, I think my main point is just that these are they're not in conflict. These things should really be supporting each other. that we need to have really good data, and the Open Contract Initiative is brilliant, and it's something which we very much support, and is very much in line with, obviously, other resource flows, especially IATI, I think. But then we do eventually then need to translate into useful, interesting tools that we can access.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Mark.
Including offline tools as well.
Oh, you want to? I know that addresses what you had said.
Oh
so
no,
I
no,
don't know
no.
if
I
you
mean,
wanna-
I would just like to say I totally agree that they're not right. They're not conflicting points. But I mean, when I'm sure a lot of the people in this room have been working, or at least know about, right, Kenya's CODI project, right, like Kenyan Open Data Initiative. Kenya has an amazing set of data sets online, probably the best in any developing country in the world. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, and they're putting a ton on all the time. And there's been amazing attempts, right, especially around the iHub, about taking this data and doing something really useful for it. And I have yet to find one case of it being really great, except for in the mapping of health facilities. It's actually really hard to take this raw national data and turn it into useful information that people can improve their daily lives with. This is not an easy task, right? Just because you have this data and you put it online, which is frankly noble, like it's awesome. I'm a researcher, I love that data, like that is the greatest thing ever. But that does not mean that, someone in Kenya can actually instantly take that data and produce a lot of value about it in their daily life.
Necessary but not sufficient, right? And we have that chain, right? It's like necessary but not sufficient raw data, turning in information, necessary but not sufficient, political power, necessary but not sufficient, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then we get to these other, capacity, political will, et cetera. And so ultimately, I think we are poor at defining our own supply chain sort of items, skill sets, capacities, et cetera, that we need in order to ultimately come to our end goal. And I think that may be a valuable exercise to do, is to actually be more specific about that.
Sarah, and sorry, I'm sure I'll make sure to grab all of you. We'll go with Sarah, Claire, and then we'll do 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, just 2 quick thoughts in response to your comments. One about the possibility or the non-possibility of responding to corruption if the project is already fixed when you start to engage. I think that there are 2 things there that we can address. One is that it's still useful to look at those problems after the fact, and you're no stranger from INT of converting those issues into lessons that then can be applied for the next time that there's a contract to try to address those risks. The other thing that we're seeing, and that's important to open contracting, is participatory monitoring isn't just about contract implementation. It also goes back to the bid or tender preparation phase, and we see in some countries where civil society organizations are being invited to participate in evaluation committees. So there's an opportunity, and even if it requires capacity development, for them to start to raise the cost for the bidders to be engaging in corrupt practices because there are more eyes on that particular problem. So that's something that gives us some hope about engaging even within the process, if not having to wait till after the egregious acts have taken place. And then on the technology side, I would ask our colleagues to weigh in on this. There are always going to be the risks in certain states that the government might be, or a government actor might be one step ahead with their ability to identify users of technologies for transparency. At the same time, there are plenty of tools that rely on encryption and rely on different security features that are improving every day and through open source that allow users in these contexts to spread information in a way that doesn't disclose their identity. So maybe there's someone who wants to talk about that, but I think that on both sides there's a real possibility, and possibilities are already being undertaken.
Claire?
No, I just wanted to come back to that point as well, and I think fragility aside, I think there is a certain requisite for democratic space, and I don't mean elections, I mean that constructive engagement. So I Paid a Bribe, for example, is a popular site in India where people can report bribe paying, but yeah, that can lead to defamation if not treated carefully, and that same tool was imported in China, shut down right away. But then you have other interesting cases, I'm thinking in Yemen, where the director of the Yemen Times, he takes all the sites that have been shut down by the government and reloads them as an alternative news source for citizens. And I think that's really interesting to, in the face of repression, violence, how citizens are incredibly creative and innovative and able to provide alternative news sources, package that information in these very challenging contexts. But I completely take your point that we need to understand the risks and potential.
just to that point, because it just happens to be something that I've been working on for quite some time. So long as we use SMS and mobile phones as our main channel, essentially, of transmission, which we still do for most of these projects, you're talking about an inherently insecure mechanism, and it's inherently monitored because, guess what, the business model of telcos is big charges for services rendered, including SMS sent, etc. And we just did, colleagues of mine, some data from us just did an analysis of SIM card registration requirements in sub-Saharan Africa that couples SIM card registration with PII, personally identifiable information, where now it's something like 98% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that require, even though you can still get gray cards, but it requires personally identifiable information to register a mobile phone, or SIM card for a mobile phone. And therefore, your PII, your personally identified, is directly tied to your number, your SIM card, your IMEI, your phone, meaning, any kind of activity on the network can actually be tied to you as a person. So goodbye burner phones, basically, right? And so as long as our channel is SMS, and this is politically sensitive information, we are putting people at risk, we are putting ourselves at risk, whatever it may be. And SMS is not routinely encrypted, and in many countries, in fact, encryption is regulated or outlawed outright. So I think we do need to take this into consideration, particularly when it gets to really, really sensitive projects or pieces of information, for sure.
Yeah. She's definitely the renowned expert on this. I mean, when it comes to...
I just shut that side down.
Oh, man. So, I mean, when we are talking about, like any kind of technology, all technologies have their weakness. That's not an issue, and there's nobody in this room who's going to debate that. But I think there's absolutely a place for part of this debate is confusing open government with open contracting, right? Open contracting has a luxury of being rather bureaucratic, right? It is not discussions about coups, right? We're not talking about activists and protests. We're talking about people finding out where companies are building a bridge, whether they want feedback on that bridge, whether they can, where's the meeting that they can go to actually go and complain about problems with that bridge. There is actually a space for this, not in everywhere, and not a blanket statement, but there is space where you can take, and even in, authoritative states and semi-democracies, where you can find value in using this technology in open contracting to help citizens engage, particularly at the local level, right? So Tiago, I don't know if everyone knows Tiago, but Tiago runs a lot of participatory budgeting processes, and he ran one in the in the DRC. And I mean, one of the things that he says is that it works absolutely best at the local level, right? This is not a great and wonderful democracy, but at the local level you can find accountability with these local authorities, and you can create these great feedback loops, particularly around budgeting process, which is part of the open contracting sort of arena. So I mean, there's absolutely a place for it. It is, context is totally key, at the end of the day, though.
So I know there's a lot of other comments, but unfortunately I'm getting the red light, and so what we want to do is there's more drinks and more food, and what we want is to continue this conversation. We can continue going. We'll be here. A lot of our panelists will be here, so just for you. So there's a card underneath your seat, and if you haven't gotten one, there's on the table. If you want to sign up to receive updates about open contracting, please give that to me or to my colleague Norma. And if you want more information, visit open-contracting.org. Thank you to our panel.
I just want to thank you all for coming tonight and getting this organized, and for getting in touch with me to get it going. So thank you to all of you here.